I really don't enjoy army painting. The only reason to do this egregious chore is to get your minis ready for gaming. And that's about it. But does it really have to be that bad? Well, as you'll find out, there are ways to make army painting better, faster, and more fun. But first, what is the most important thing in army painting? As a proud owner of several armies, I can honestly tell you that the most important thing is... If you paint a single display model, you can go wild, you can go crazy and nuts and goofy and wacky. But army painting is a whole nother level. It would be quite silly to paint an army without a proper plan. So while display models can be started with just a rough idea in mind, army painting requires knowledge of every single step. Or most of them. As I am building these new models from Cities of Sigmar, I already know exactly what the plan is. For this batch of 20 models, I'll be using a tutorial from Colored Kraken Studio, which conveniently is today's sponsor, but more on them later. This should be the result of said tutorial, and apparently it's only 60 minutes per model. Huh, color me impressed. Whether this will turn out to be the case or not, you'll find out. What I like the most here is that the steps are quite simple and you don't have to use too many colors. In fact, the most prominent is the red on the helmet and the teal glow. Now, is there a Cities of Sigmar faction that has a red helmet? Not really. Furthermore, I wanted to use more magenta. So I simply decided to paint the helmet with magenta, as well as the glove and the shield, and pull it off as the Lethis sub-faction. This is important because the red on the helmet really captures your attention, and if I left the helmets on these bumpkin steel, they wouldn't really stand out. But other than that, the color palette will be very similar. So of course I primed the minis. Needless to say, you can do this with a spray can. And I started off painting the metallics. Now, in this tutorial, they are dry brushing all the metallics, which is actually quite efficient as it saves time and it makes them feel more used and battered. Since these are the first layers you're gonna paint, you can also afford to hit the parts that'll be painted later. And, funnily enough, this is where my first fuck-up happened. Instead of being faster, yet more messy, I applied the paint way too carefully. As a result, I spent about 12 to 15 minutes to dry brush the metallics and highlight them a little bit. I even added some scratches here and there, and the result is nice, but if the tutorial said it's gonna take 60 minutes per model, that is already 25% out the window. Given that it took 15 minutes per model and there are 20 of them, this whole ordeal took staggering 5 hours. Yeah, and if I just allowed myself to be a bit messier, I bet I could slash it down to half of that. After all, I would still have to base coat the rest anyway. And this kinda goes hand in hand with the next point. So since I still had to base coat all the other parts, there was a long journey ahead. Initially I thought that this entire thing can be done in one afternoon, or at most one day, and I was being f***ing dumb. Let's address the elephant in the room. I am painting 20 models at once. I didn't paint them in batches, I went balls deep and I went in dry, and as a result I suffered. Just like in real life. If you paint a single model from start to finish, it's very easy to stay motivated, as you see the progress right away. This is not the case when you paint too many models. So while it might be efficient, you are turning yourself into a machine and have no fun. If you are not used to army painting, please do yourself a favor and split your army into smaller batches. Even these 20 guys aren't a full army, but painting more than that would absolutely destroy my ass. And it's pretty sore already. An ideal batch will really depend on the model, but I feel like 3 to 5 minis at once is probably optimal, as you'll see decent progress happening, which will keep you going. Any more than 10 is not recommended, but like, again, it really depends. At this point I am at step 3 and 4 of the original tutorial. The whole thing is split into 12 steps, but obviously some are faster and some are slower, and I think the most tedious part is behind us. Honestly, base coating and building the models are my least favorite parts, but as it all comes together, that's just magical. It's also the reason why I decided to deviate from the original plan, and instead of painting the skin tones in multiple steps, I went ahead and finished the skin on every model before continuing. As I paint all these different textures, let's talk about the tutorial I am using. As I mentioned, it's from Colored Kraken Studio, as they offered to sponsor this video. I had a look at several tutorials from them, and this one I liked the most for this project. I especially appreciate the simplicity of using just 2 different vibrant colors. The guide also saves you time by showing you how to paint faster. For example, I used just 2 different paints to highlight the textures, and then some washes on top to make them different from each other. This is just one of the many clever hacks in the tutorials, and I love them for it. There are 3 books that feature world-class mini painters. The first one is all about the basics, which is always nice to have, especially if you want to introduce this hobby to someone else. The guide that I am using is from the second volume, which features 20 of such tutorials for your armies and board games, and the third book is about painting with other mediums such as oils, dry pigments, etc. Personally, I am quite excited about this project because having physical books that you can just go through for inspiration or show someone is awesome. So if you wanna obliterate your pile of grey plastic, check them out. There will be a link in the description. So, as I mentioned, I used various brushstrokes on the leather and wood to create texture, and over that I applied washes to make them different. It's up to you what kind of wash you wanna use, but in the guide there are 3 different washes. And instead of using a pre-made wash product, you can use your regular paint. Just water down that bitch and do it like that. It should just stain the texture underneath to create more variety. So for the wood, I went for warm brown, and for the rest I used greenish and purple washes. Again, having done this 20 times, I think it's essential to have another tool to keep your spirits up. Doing the same thing for 5 hours can be boring as f***. So here are a few things to keep it interesting. 1. Listen to music, podcasts, audiobooks, or even video essays. I love all of these options, but for the most part, video essays and podcasts are my favorite. However, there is a big caveat to this. You gotta know what steps you're gonna take. If the stuff you're painting requires your attention and the background noise takes it away, that's no good. For army painting, it's not a big deal because usually you know all your steps, but if not, it can be. Another thing that you can do is reward yourself. What I mean by this is treat yourself by painting a character once you finish your batch. So for example, if you are painting a batch of 5 or 10 minis and you are done, instead of going for the next batch right away, just paint a character that you can really enjoy. This is something similar that I have done myself with these minis, but not exactly. When I finished a certain step of the tutorial, I decided to take one miniature and finish it all the way. And like this, when I got really bored, instead of just quitting and doing something else, I still kept progressing, but a bit slower. This was also useful because I knew what the finished mini will look like. And by the way, the step that you see me do right now is another very clever thing that the tutorial shows. Instead of building all the magenta from dark to light, I can simply sketch everything with this orangey cream color. And over that, I can apply a layer or 2 of pure magenta from Chimera, and the result speaks for itself. This is one of the bigger changes that I implemented, since this particular faction has more of a amethyst or magenta colors rather than red. And after highlighting everything with a mix of magenta and sunny skin tone, I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, it did require some back and forth, and you can see all the unedited footage on my Patreon if you are really interested in that, but after all the highlighting, I was ready for the atmospheric blue glow. First of all, for any kind of glow effects and OSL, you need really prominent shadows. But as it is right now, the models are a bit too light. The guide here actually deals with this in the most simple way. Instead of keeping the left side of the model dark from the start and really being careful about that, they just tell you to airbrush the shade with a contrast paint. By spraying this turquoise contrast paint from below and left side, I create a very cool atmospheric shading, on which I can add the glow effect. It also unites everything so it looks more synchronized. For the glow itself, I am using a combo of emerald and pale yellow to paint it. If the model is dark enough, it shouldn't be a problem to get it right, but there are still a few things to keep in mind. 1. Highlight the mini just from the direction of the light source. 2. Focus on the edges. 3. Leave some of the shadows showing. In this case, the light is coming from the left, so that's the side I highlight. I definitely go way harder on the light than the tutorial, so this is a bit of a matter of taste, but I think it was worth it. Of course, the same has to be done for the metallics by adding some emerald into the metallic paint. Again, I am skipping a lot here, and you'll find the extra footage on Patreon, but for this step it's pretty much the same once you realize where to place the blue glow. Now, there are a few more steps ahead of us, but I just want to mention that at this point, I spent around 2 to 3 hours per single mini. But hold on, it said 60 minutes! Well, yeah. But you can go ahead and take a guess why it takes me so much longer. Is it A, they are way too fast, or is it B, because I am way too slow? Or maybe it is C, the minis are too different. Or it might be D, I did something wrong. Now, if you answered A, that's incorrect. If you answered B, that's also wrong. But if you answered C or D, well, that's also wrong because it's all of the above. See, the featured artists for this tutorial are doing commissions, so it's no wonder that they are fast. On the other hand, I don't consider myself to be a fast painter, because for the most part I paint just single miniatures. It's worthwhile mentioning that even the minis are quite different, and if you add a few minutes to every step of the process, it adds up rather quickly. As I mentioned, I also could have been messier, yet faster when applying metallics. And looking at the minis now, I really didn't have to bother as much with the leather texture, since it's barely visible after adding the contrast paint shading. Despite all that, keep in mind that painting in general is about optimizing speed and quality, and usually the longer you paint something, the higher quality it can be, so it's not like I regret putting in so much work. After dry brushing the bases from both sides so the left side is clearly glowy, it was time for a quick rimming session. Rimming is my favorite activity, because, well, it's just so satisfying. After applying the decals and making them a bit weathered, here they are. Yes, it took more time than I wanted, but given the result, I think it's adequate. And of course, with proper planning, batching, and making it more fun, army painting doesn't have to be a bad experience. However, as you might know, things don't always go according to the plan. In fact, one time I painted an entire Space Marine army and I absolutely wrecked it. So if you want to avoid the mistakes I made when painting my Space Marines, check out this video. Trust me, it's worth it. And see you there.